Today at the National Press Club, award-winning astronomer Lisa Harvey-Smith. A professor of practice at the University of New South Wales, she's also the federal government's Women in STEM ambassador. Lisa Harvey-Smith with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia. My name is Sabra Lane. I am the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC Radio Current Affairs program, AM. We have something very special for you today. Professor Lisa Harvey, the Australian Government's Women in STEM ambassador. And for those, you are all familiar here in the audience about what STEM is, but at home they may not be. STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. If you're following online, our Twitter user handle is @PressClubAUST, and you can also use the hashtag MPC. Everybody, please join me in welcoming Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith.
Well, thank you, Sabra, and thank you very much for being here. Look, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today and the peoples of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people of those nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I grew up in a small village in rural Essex in England, about 60 kilometres north of London. Now, the skies there were pretty dark, so at night my dad and I would sometimes go outside and look at the stars in the garden. Now, in 1986, when I was only 6 years old and knee-high to a grasshopper, Halley's Comet came to visit. Now, how many of you here saw Halley's Comet? Yes, there's hands up. So Halley's Comet is an ice-covered rock. Some people call it a dirty snowball, and it's whizzing around the sun. It's about 5 kilometres across, and its orbit takes it close to the sun about every 76 years or so. And as it gets close to the sun, it starts to heat up. So the ice on its surface turns into a gas. And that gas is pushed away from the sun by this huge energetic stream of particles that are whizzing out of our sun, called the solar wind. It looks magnificent, this tail behind the comet, or so I'm told, because actually I never saw Halley's Comet. The English clouds got the better of me. But you know what? Not seeing Halley's Comet was actually a pivotal moment in my life and career, because this was an exciting global event. But for me, it was a non-event, but it got me hooked on astronomy. So by the age of 12, I was looking up at the stars as a matter of course. My parents encouraged me to join my local astronomical society, and I really loved it despite being the only person under 50 in the room. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a 12-year-old girl, that was me, and a bunch of retired engineers in grey cardigans. That was pretty much my astronomical society. But who says you can't be what you can't see? Because these guys were fantastic for me. They were so friendly. They lent me books and telescopes. They took me to the London Planetarium. They were keen to help me. They egged me on to take my astronomy exams. So these men were important role models to me. My parents, too, they gave me a tremendous gift by cultivating my interest in astronomy. I remember my dad standing next to me in freezing cold farmers' fields while I eagerly snapped pictures of the moon and the craters. My mum, after very long days at work, driving me to observatories in the middle of the night, and their support made the real difference to me, and it meant the world to me. So it makes me think really that as adults, the support and encouragement that we can give to young people is the most important thing, the most precious commodity that we can give to our children. And to help a young person to cultivate their sense of wonder and curiosity about the world is an incredible gift that we can give to them. But sadly, this isn't always translating. So the numbers of young people studying science, technology, engineering and maths, the STEM subjects, is actually stagnating and declining in some cases. So we've got some serious work to do if we want to enable some more STEM love stories like mine. And there's another problem, because women make up only 17% of the STEM qualified population in Australia. And at the same time, STEM skills are becoming more vital in the jobs market. So this mismatch is storing up potentially a catastrophic future for millions of young Australians who risk missing out on important employment opportunities and on their economic independence. Now, diversifying our workforce in STEM is important for several reasons. And I'll give the example of technological solutions designed in a monoculture that are rarely fit for purpose. And that example is in artificial intelligence, or AI. Now, there's a growing body of evidence that many AI systems actually magnify the gender and racial biases that we have in our society. When used in facial recognition, or self-driving cars, or police databases, AI can actually spell the difference between life and death. Now, the vast majority of people around the world designing AI systems, especially for commercial applications, are white men. And it really, really shows. For example, crime predicting software used across the US has shown bias against black men, making them targets of law enforcement operations and giving them longer jail terms. Facial recognition technologies, increasingly used in policing and in war zones, works 99% of the time for white men and 35% of the time for black women. Now that is storing up some real problems. And there are loss of employment opportunities potentially too, with some advertising algorithms showing high-income job adverts preferentially to men. But there's also an economic imperative for greater diversity in STEM. Advanced and physical and mathematical sciences contribute $145 billion to our economy, and that's about 11% of our GDP. And upskilling about 1% of our workforce would add $57 billion to GDP over the next 20 years into STEM roles. So imagine the difference that gender equity could make to the economy, upskilling more women into these occupations. But despite more than 300 targeted women in STEM programs across the country, including robotics, drone, coding camps, and more, we're barely moving forward in the number of girls taking up further study in IT and engineering and the physical sciences. In 2006, more than 10 years ago, the STEM qualified population of women was 15%, and today it's only 17%, so it's barely inching forward. But fortunately, the Australian government is coordinating a suite of actions that will help to tackle these issues and hopefully will shift the dial on gender equity in STEM. Last year, the federal government commissioned the Decadal Plan for Women in STEM, a 10-year plan developed by the Australian Academy of Science in partnership with the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, and also many people in the community, some of whom will be in the room today. The Decadal Plan sets the direction for the STEM sector to take action on gender equity, and it's a job for all of us. The federal government, in response, also released the Advancing Women in STEM strategy, which sets out the government's commitment to action on gender equity, and it outlines the government's leadership role and support in 3 key areas, and those are enabling STEM potential through education, supporting women in STEM careers, and importantly, making women in STEM more visible. Then there's my work as the Australian Government's Women in STEM Ambassador. And my role is to work across all disciplines of STEM, with government, with the research sector, with education, and with industry to drive gender equity. We want to find out what works and do more of it and accelerate the pace of change. And to bring these changes to all Australians, whether in remote regional areas or the big metropolitan cities. So I have a great team, and we're focusing on 2 important areas. The first is education, to highlight pathways to employment and reduce gender bias both in the home and in the classroom. And the second area is to break down structural and systemic barriers to women's retention and their career advancement in STEM, in their careers, and to transform workplaces for the better. But I'll start at the beginning with education. So the kids of this generation find themselves in an increasingly STEM-driven jobs market. They'll need to be ready to find solutions to global challenges. We have climate change, we have automation, ethical development of AI, as I mentioned earlier, and providing clean water and food for our growing populations. Now, these solutions can only be created by teams with a diverse range of skills, combining expertise in technology, in computing, but also creativity and collaboration. So how can we get our kids ready for this future? Well, the good news is we can all contribute through our interactions with younger members of the family. Now, we all know that maths and counting are crucial skills, with many jobs requiring a good level of numerical ability. This opens up a vast range of job opportunities in the retail, scientific, technological, medical, business, IT, and teaching professions. But to avoid excluding girls from these occupations, it is vital that we start talking to them about numbers and counting at the earliest possible opportunity. So why girls in particular? Well, there is a psychological condition called maths anxiety, and it's actually highly contagious. Parents and teachers can easily transmit their dislike or lack of confidence in mathematics, and it tends to affect girls more acutely than it does boys. So maths anxiety is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It actually leads to a lack of confidence in maths, which can cause poorer outcomes in standardised tests. Luckily, we can help to alleviate maths anxiety by approaching numbers with a sense of open-mindedness and positivity, and by talking about numbers with girls as often as we do with boys. But surely we're already doing this, aren't we? Aren't we? Well, sadly, no, we're not. Researchers in the US found that parents of 2-year-olds talk about numbers or counting, for example, how many flowers can you see, 3 times more often with boys than they do with girls. And this is just parents having general conversations with their children. When we're aware of these biases that we hold, we can ensure that we don't perpetuate them. What we read to children also has an impact. When the market research company Nielsen looked at the 100 most popular children's books in 2017, they found most to be dominated by male characters. Male characters were twice as likely to have speaking roles than female characters, and they had far more lines when they did speak. So it is no coincidence that the cover illustration of my new children's book, Under the Stars, Astrophysics for Bedtime, shows a girl and her wombat looking up at the stars. I think wombats are underrepresented too. But we can choose educational books with women in leading roles, and it's a great way to support your children's educational needs, and not just for girls, but also for boys. If you're thinking about gifts over the summer holidays, you might consider some STEM-related books that will help your kids flourish. Careers matter too, career conversations, and there are some brilliant resources to help you discuss careers with STEM with children. So a great thing coming out of the government is the Girls in STEM Toolkit, and it's a fun and really engaging website, and I've had some great feedback. This is funded by the federal government. It has resources, activities, even quizzes for girls about careers, and its aim is to empower girls to see a future for themselves in STEM. You can find it by typing Girls in STEM Toolkit into any search engine that you like. And 2 other things I recommend are the Careers with STEM magazines and the STEM Careers Guide, which you can also find online. So get going with those with your families. And of course, it's not just the home environment that influences your children, it's schools too. And teachers can help by delivering STEM content in a way that is engaging to all children. Using modern technologies makes STEM relevant to students' lives and helps them acquire better learning, problem-solving and thinking skills. And collaborative approaches, rather than individual ones, are more likely to engage girls in STEM, especially in STEM classrooms. And mixed methods of assessment also help, so exams, group work and practical skills. And that helps to better determine the students' overall grasp of STEM. Many teachers are already implementing these important methods, but greater adoption of integrated STEM teaching must always be the goal. So as educators, we can do more to remove biases from STEM classrooms by gaining awareness of our own beliefs and our attitudes about girls' engagement and aptitude with STEM. Unfortunately, examples of classroom bias are not hard to find either. Educational researchers in the US reviewed hours and hours of footage from science classes, and they observed carefully the interactions between students and teachers in those classrooms. And the results were startling. 70% of the teachers' time was spent focused on the boys. Boys were asked significantly more questions and given more feedback on their work. When girls were called upon, they received less waiting time for answers. Boys were more likely to shout out and were allowed to speak over girls. And boys were more likely to be called to the front to do science demonstrations. And girls, on the other hand, and some people in the room might be familiar with this, they were more likely to be praised for the appearance of their work and how neat it was, and then shoehorned into roles that may be termed as administrative in the classroom. So treating people equitably in STEM education settings is vital. To enable young people to achieve and receive the education they deserve, we should incorporate case studies like this into teacher training and encourage regular classroom audits to eliminate such biases. Another great thing is connecting students with diverse role models in classrooms. That can make a big difference. When I was growing up, I didn't know any real-life scientists or engineers. But through my local astronomical society, I came into contact with professional astronomers who generously gave their time and expertise, and that put me on a path that I could barely have believed back then when I was 14 years old. And since then, I've had an amazingly fulfilling career so far. I've peered inside the birthplaces of stars using giant radio telescopes on 4 continents. I've mapped out the structure of the gas in the Milky Way using a giant 305-metre radio telescope in the Puerto Rican jungle. I've weighed a supermassive black hole using the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder radio telescope in outback WA. And thanks to the guidance of my role models, my life has been enriched by the possibilities that a STEM career can bring. So to try and give back, I like to try and be a role model for young people too. A few years ago, I set up a partnership with my local public school through the STEM Professionals in Schools program. Now, this program gives students and teachers across the country access to local STEM role models, and it helps to break down preconceptions about who belongs in STEM. And it's trying to boost students' sense of belonging in STEM too. I must say, I love seeing the children light up as we explore the universe together, or learn physics using food colouring and messy play, or design a mission to Mars. It's incredible to watch children's imaginations as their mind opens and their affinity for STEM blossoms. So I highly recommend getting STEM role models into your local schools. And if you can't find a match through the STEM Professionals in Schools program, another great resource is the STEM Women Database, which is a great avenue to try. It's a list of more than 2,000 STEM women across Australia who are open to speaking opportunities. You can find it at stemwomen.org.au, and if you're lucky, you might find a fantastic role model who is willing to visit your local school and talk about what they do. So we're doing all this work, and it's great to encourage girls into STEM careers. But here's a question for us. Are we making it a place that they want to stay? Well, sadly, the data say no. Women are actually leaving STEM careers at much higher rates than men. I don't think it's too much to ask for workplaces to function well, to treat people with respect, and to actively manage employees' physical and mental health. Our jobs should be flexible enough to accommodate our other responsibility in life, like family commitments and social activities that boost our well-being. We all want to work in an environment that is free from discrimination and bias. But women still face significant discrimination and bias at work. According to a recent survey by Male Champions of Change, 2/3 of women have had their voices devalued at work, and around half see a lack of diversity in senior leadership as a barrier to their career progression. A lack of support for men's parental leave also has negative consequences. Currently, 53% of fathers feel that their workplaces are not supportive of them taking parental leave. 27% of fathers have experienced discrimination at work related to their parental leave. ranging from negative attitudes to threats of dismissal, completely unacceptable. And at the same time, more men than ever want to take flexible work in order to care for children. And it's important to realise this: until men and women are equal at home and are sharing the unpaid work, equality in the workplace will never be achieved. And it gets worse. In a recent survey by Science and Technology Australia, half of Australian women and 1 in 10 Australian men in STEM have experienced sexual harassment. 70% of respondents chose not to report this harassment due to fear of reprisals and a lack of confidence in institutional policies. Now, to me, these are not just statistics. Far too often I hear deeply personal stories from women in the field about the harassment that they have faced. Women who love their work but are forced out due to powerful men who act with impunity and face minimal or no consequences. Perpetrators who continue in senior roles whilst their students and colleagues live in fear or in ignorance. Organisations that scramble to protect their own reputations whilst another woman with talent, skill and passion is pushed away. So I welcome the fact that the Australian Human Rights Commission is holding a national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. And I'll be looking forward with keen interest to hearing its recommendations and to working with leaders across the sector to try to implement these. So when we look at this tangled mess of barriers to women's progression, it becomes abundantly clear why so many women leave in the middle of their STEM careers or fail to reach senior positions. Solutions are simple to identify, we can all talk about it, but not so easy to implement. These solutions include removing discrimination and bias from workplace practices, enabling equal carers leave and encouraging men to take it up, enforcing proper workplace behaviour, identifying targets for women's career progression, and taking steps to eliminate pay gaps. But to be successful, these actions must be deliberate, strategic, and system-wide. For change to really take root, senior leaders and managers must commit to specific, tailored, and measurable actions to remove structural barriers in the workplace. If you're not already tackling these issues in an organised and strategic way, the question must be, why not? To give you some ideas, though, and inspiration for actions you can take in your workplace, I want to mention 3 case studies. The first is a project my team has just launched, which will address the effects of unconscious bias on career progression. So we know this. Removing names and gender pronouns from applications works pretty well for combating gender bias. NASA, you may have heard of them, recently trialled a process of anonymising application materials for observing time on the Hubble Space Telescope. So they adopted a system where the names of the reviewers and the scientists were made known to each other only after the review had taken place. So it was an anonymous review process. What happened? Well, unsurprisingly, for the first time in 18 years, proposals with female leads did marginally better than those led by men. So my office is keen to adopt this methodology in Australia, and several Australian research organisations and funding bodies have agreed to take part in a national trial. So this will provide important data on the effectiveness of anonymised review and provide a strong evidence base for the STEM sector to take action on more equitable processes in the future. The second success story I want to tell you about is a targeted intervention that happened this year, which was led by the Federal Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. And it was about the nomination and assessment process for the Prime Minister's Prizes for Science. So you may have heard of the Prime Minister's Prizes for Science. They're Australia's most prestigious science prizes, recognising wonderful innovation, research and science teaching. And they're prestigious not just because the awards total $750,000, but they get a lot of publicity. In 2018, a lot of people, including myself, expressed concern that only one of the 7 prizes was awarded to a woman. This followed several years of consistently low representation amongst women in the prize recipient pool. So the department decided to develop a plan to do something about it. And this was based on evidence and best practice. Through the use of a strategic communications plan, they encouraged nominations from diverse groups, including women, Indigenous and LGBTQI+ communities, using social media campaigns. They also reached out directly to STEM leaders, encouraging them to nominate outstanding people in their fields. They removed language such as distinguished or exemplary that can create barriers to participation because women are less likely to identify with these terms. Selection committee members were shown materials about unconscious bias before the shortlist meetings. And by taking these deliberate and strategic measures, nominations of women increased from 32% in 2018 to 42% in 2019. The outcomes were very different too. We saw the highest number of women recognised in the prize's history, with 5 of the 7 prizes awarded to women. Now that's not bad, is it, for a straightforward set of strategic actions. And finally, in what works, I wanted to talk about SAGE, Science in Australia Gender Equity. This is an accreditation for institutional best practice and is supported by the Australian government. Through this program, currently 44 universities and research organisations have been guided through a journey of self-reflection, change and evaluation to improve gender equity and inclusion in their workplaces. SAGE participants have put in place fairer parental leave provisions, support for allied programs for LGBTQI+ people, Indigenous traineeships, parents' rooms at work, and many more initiatives designed to make workplaces more people-friendly. Now what SAGE is really, it's an attempt to embed workplace inclusion into an organisation's business as usual. And this, I think, is a model that organisations across the sector would do well to adopt. To be sustainable, though, we must caution that the work must be led always from the top, with the burden of driving change on the organisation, not on the marginalised individuals themselves. So here's the bad news. According to the World Economic Forum, the gender pay gap will take more than 200 years to close at our current rate of progress. That is just not funny. My team and I are committed to taking action that will accelerate this pace of change and to enable all Australians to thrive in the workplaces of the future. We're planning a national awareness-raising initiative that will communicate the social and environmental good that can be achieved through STEM careers, leading to greater engagement in STEM education and showing all Australians that STEM is much more than just scientific research. We're working on how to allocate resources more fairly in the higher education and research sector by bypassing unconscious bias. We're facilitating diverse STEM role models in schools and in the media. But we need your help. Parents and families can help break the cycle of damaging stereotypes that prevent girls from achieving their full potential. Don't ask girls, what colour are the flowers? Ask them, how many can you see? Give them science books with female lead characters and wombats and talk to them about the natural world. Teachers can help too by adopting student-centred STEM learning, talking about STEM careers with their students and filling their classrooms with diverse and interesting STEM role models. And leaders in business, institutions and government. We must research, plan and commit to actions that break down systemic barriers to women's progression in STEM careers. We must hold ourselves and our teams accountable for making meaningful and permanent changes to the systems and structures that are holding too many great people back. And I'll say it again, if you're not already doing this in a deliberate and strategic way, the question must be, why not? We all want to live in a world where our achievements are defined by our skills and attributes, not by our gender. Where a child's vocation is the result of their interests and abilities, not the expectations of society. Where a woman who might one day find a cure for cancer can follow her dreams without impediment, never to be bullied, harassed or marginalised from her chosen path. But this change won't happen on its own. And it won't even happen in our lifetimes if we don't accelerate the pace of change. So let's set our alarm clocks for the 28th of July, 2061, the night that Halley's Comet next comes to visit the sun. And on that night, we'll look at the stars, and maybe I'll talk to my great-grandniece and reminisce about my life and my work in astronomy and astrophysics and maybe in gender equity. And hopefully she'll look at me with a puzzled expression and ask, why did we ever need a Women in STEM ambassador? Now, I look forward to working with you all to make that vision a reality. Thank you very much.
I wonder, given that you are a published author, you have heard of the Rebel Girls series book of stories, which are, I'm reliably informed, and perhaps I should come up with a better analogy than this, but it's like crack cocaine for young girls. They just can't get enough. And these are stories about There've been popular stories about women who've become
the achievements
famous.
of women in science.
That's right.
And,
so science and actors and whatnot. But perhaps there is a need for an Australian version of Rebel Story, Good Night Stories for women scientists, featuring perhaps yourself and Emma Johnson and some scientists. Would you ever think of doing something like that?
I've looked at the market. Actually, there's a lot of these great books out there, and I know Tech Girls are superheroes, and other groups have wonderful books with STEM role models. So you just got to look for them. They're out there. They might not be in the airport bookshops, but you've got to look for them and have a little look on search engines for, presents this December, and you might find some really cool stuff.
Should science and math be compulsory in years 11 and 12 to help drive students into studying those subjects, to make not only girls but the population overall, to lift the standards right across the population, given that we keep hearing this message about the need to be agile and we need to be more diverse in what we're doing here in Australia?
My attitude to education is build it and they will come. So if you make science boring, people won't want to do it, and maths the same. If you make it vibrant and interesting and relevant to everyday life, and we see the use that these subjects have in everyday life, then that is a more sensible long-term strategy in my view. I'm not an educational researcher or expert, but that's my general belief, that we have to always increase the quality of our education and our engagement with young people, whether we're families, or whether we're educational professionals.
Is there an example anywhere around the world of an education system that is working, where girls are excelling?
There are complicated factors that lead to varying numbers of women in STEM careers around the world. Some of those are due to education systems, some are due to cultural expectations. So, for example, in the Middle East, in Thailand, in some countries in Central Asia, there are more women than men in, say, engineering. And it's just cultural reasons. And in fact, studies show that in the Nordic countries, which are traditionally known to have generally better gender equity outcomes across the board, they have fewer women in STEM. Now, there are many theories as to why that is, and it may be due to women just having simply more choice over the subjects they do. But lingering stereotypes around who belongs in STEM, who belongs in these subjects, are probably more the cause. So in countries where girls are really driven by their families to go into engineering as a really great career for a woman, then it's more likely that girls are going to go into that area. So I think that's where parents and teachers and careers advisors have a role.
And that's an interesting segue to the parents, career advisors. How do you truly send that message to young girls at an early age that STEM is for them and that there is a place for them in science careers?
Yeah. Well, we're very much affected by everything we see. We see books, we see television, radio, and now it's YouTube, whatever it is that kids are doing. I'm not down with the kids myself. But what people are seeing in their environment and the environmental factors and the way we dress them and the toys we give them and the books we give them and what they're watching on television, all of that is having an influence. And we know that we're still dealing with residual differences between the various gender roles that are seen by society. So we're really fighting against that tide. So that's where families can make a difference. I don't know if that adequately answers your question, but maybe you can follow up.
What about women putting themselves forward for senior positions when it comes to STEM management positions? A lot of women, and I know this in the media too, that it comes down to these are the 10 selection criteria, I easily meet 7, gosh, I don't meet 3 of those, so I'm not going to put my hand up. Whereas a bloke could think, oh yeah, I matched 3 of those, I reckon I could give it a shot. And then they give it their all, whereas women are a little bit reticent.
Well, Sarah, this is exactly where we need to focus on not fixing the women. We need to fix the system. So if you have selection criteria, you've got to stick to them. If you have things that are just, okay, it would be good to have this, you've got to say that. So that people with different levels of pushiness, shall we say, and different levels of pushing oneself forward, cockiness, whatever you want to call it, people aren't disadvantaged by cultural and gendered factors. So I think in the way we recruit, we can do better. And the example with the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science with the Prime Minister's Prize is seeing that gendered language can go. There's actually a script online, so you can go to this website, you can paste in your job advert, and it will flag problematic language, which will actually repel certain applicants from certain groups or cultures which may not find that language palatable. So, it's the way that we design our systems that's at fault. It's not that women aren't putting themselves forward. It's actually the system that is not being open enough.
All right, and it's interesting actually, just picking up on your point, why is it that women are seen as pushy, whereas a bloke who would perhaps be insistent is, he's forceful?
It's another joyous cultural element that we need to work on.
Yeah. Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Barbara. Professor Tim Shaw, member of the National Press Club Board. Thank you so much for your address today. Can I draw you to the decision of the Victorian Government yesterday? They introduced the Gender Equity Bill, Gender Equality Bill, across public service organisations, universities and local councils. Now, referring to what you've discussed in Sage today, I'd like you to speculate that if the Victorian Government came to you today and said as a STEM ambassador, should we or should we not have Year 11 and 12 campuses exclusively staffed by women in the faculty, exclusively for young women to develop and to promote STEM? Secondly, from the university educative process, should corporate Australia and the world be looking at focusing on the promotion of internships for those women graduates to be able to develop and to work further in STEM? Ambassadors sometimes have to stop being diplomatic. I'd like you to be political. What's your advice to the Victorian Government, and if you had the chance, the federal government, about effective guarantees and equality for women in STEM to be legislated?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. And I do have, fortunately, great opportunity to speak to the federal government directly. But I haven't read the bill, and I don't know the full details of the Victorian case. I read it in the newspaper yesterday. That's the extent of my deep knowledge. But on the question, it's great to see, the details that I've seen, that there is a serious and concerted effort in the Victorian government to actually advance gender equity. In response to your comments about specific programs for girls and women, I always have some slight hesitation for this, because although we do need to provide leadership opportunities for men, women, all workers in our workforces, the problem isn't the women. In fact, the problem is the system. So maybe the men need to go on a course about how to stop creating barriers for women's progression in the workplace. And men and women need to go on courses about how we create gender equal and open and inclusive workplaces. So we need to stop framing this as a fixing the women problem. We need to actually start stepping back and thinking holistically, how do we actually fix the structural systemic problems, not just barge a few more women into the pipeline and hope some of them pop out the other side. So that's absolutely not a diplomatic answer. That's my feelings on the subject. But I'd love to see more details of what's been done in Victoria, and I would welcome that general approach of dedicated actions on gender equity across the board.
Jonathan Webb.
Thanks for a terrific address, Lisa. Jonathan Webb, I'm the science editor at the ABC. My question's pretty similar to Tim's, but I might ask it in a slightly more open-ended way. The case studies, the excellent case studies you gave of positive action, were all in science organisations or regimes of one sort or another. Are there any regulatory or policy changes that could be made at a much wider level now that would start to change things? It strikes me that paid parental leave might be one of them that you mentioned, or some sort of equal pay requirement. Do you have any specific ideas that we could implement right away at a broader level?
That is always important, the policy side of this. But do you know what? We actually need to think holistically again, as I said before. We need to think about the actions that we can take in individual workplaces, because that's where people work. And you see, what are the problems that we can actually identify in people's everyday experiences? They happen on the ground in workplaces. So I actually think that industry needs to do a lot more of the heavy lifting. And government also needs to plan, which it is doing. And so that's great, both working together, driven by the strategic elements of the decadal plan for women in STEM and the government's strategy as well. I think that actually is happening. So it's being taken seriously across government, it's being taken seriously in industry and academia, higher education. We need to bring the education sector as a whole along with that story too. So the job the academies have been doing, the academies of science and technology and engineering, is really great in bringing all that together through the decadal plan for women in STEM, and then trying to bring small to medium enterprises along, major industries, major research organisations.
Nick Stewart.
Thank you for a terrific speech. A couple of years before Hallie's comment, I was actually in Papua New Guinea. My daddy took me outside onto the veranda and pointed up to the moon and said, for the first time ever, people are landing on the moon, they're walking on the moon. And I looked very hard and I realised I could actually see them.
Yep.
And that's why I'm a journalist. The point is, you referred in particular to SAGE, Science and Gender Equity. The universities have done that. What I'd like you to do is reflect on, firstly, how effective has that been within the university sector? Are there any particular laggards that you'd like to mention? And secondly, what are the other sectors of society that really need to pay attention to this, excluding media, of course?
Of course. Well, let's talk about media. Let's start with media. So thanks for that. Thanks for that lead-in. You know, media is very important and powerful in this. I will get to your other points. But, you know, what media has a responsibility for is it's very influential in society and what we read and what we see. And every day I look through the newspaper and I just think it's a sea of men. Sports section is men's sport, and the business section is men's business. You know, it's just full of men, and every sector and every part of society, everyone, including myself, my own office, what I do, what I say, and how I represent myself, we have to continually be on guard to make sure that we're not perpetuating these things. So I think media also has to engage with this, and I'm sure will. But across the other sectors, as you say, SAGE has been really successful in higher education and research. It's only been going for 2 years and it's a pilot, so I think it's been remarkably successful up to this stage. And I've seen the end of year report that came out earlier this year, I think it was, and they did quite a good analysis of the outcomes, and 44 organisations part of this, and the changes that happen within those organisations are strategic, they are long-term, they are planned, so we won't necessarily see all the benefits immediately. And, you know, SAGE is also part of an international scheme, Athena Swan from the UK, and we've been interacting. I was in the UK recently talking to the CEO about how we can develop SAGE in Australia to make it more inclusive, all types of diversity and intersectionality, not just gender. I was talking to our New Zealand colleagues as well about how they might introduce such a thing. So I think it's really positive when you can have a voluntary code where people want to get on board. They're given reward, recognition, a community. They're given support and resources. And I think that's really the value of these types of inclusion programs. And I think that's really the way to go. Sometimes you can look to policy too quickly, and sometimes guiding people on a path that they want to follow is a more practical and actually a more palatable and successful path long term.
Other sectors?
Other sectors, for example? What sectors are you thinking of?
Engineering, or are there any particular banking? Where are women's rights or women's not being recognised?
Well, it's across the board, really. If you look at, gender pay gaps across different occupations, they are very significant in most occupations. So we really need, and I need, as the Women in STEM ambassador, as we build this work, to build a broader coalition. Not just the higher education and research sector, the sort of STEM industries, but larger companies. And I know some work is being done with SMEs as well by the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, building on the decadal plan for women in STEM. So we've got to try and help small businesses too, who might struggle with some of the financial implications of certain regulations, if those were introduced, help them to actually come along on this journey and do effective things that they can do in their workplaces without having too erroneous impacts.
So just a reminder, we'll take some questions from the floor. If you're keen for a question, we'll come to you in a tick and put your hand up. John Millard.
Thank you, Sabra. John Millard, freelance. Thank you very much for your very well-directed address, but it's only part of a problem generally, isn't it? You can't get more STEM than being an astrophysicist. But it's a generalised problem that people in science or related fields are generally under-rewarded both in pay and promotion opportunities. Many of our best scientists and whatever go overseas because of that. In fact, the professions generally are littered, dare we say, with ex-scientists, etc., who become bureaucrats or in industry or, God help us, even journalism. But how much do you think that the general problem, recognising women in STEM, are part of the general problem, and the problem won't go away until they are decently rewarded and promoted?
Yeah, the transfer of people with STEM skills into other occupations has got to be a positive. I've got to say that first. Yeah. As the chief scientist said in a address earlier this year, I think it was, that it's great if we have scientists who move on to other fields. We can't all sit in a lab and look at coloured liquid or whatever it is scientists do, stare through test tubes and telescopes and all sorts of things. But that is great, but if somebody has the skill and the passion and the aptitude and wants to carry on a research career, of course, they need to be supported to do that. But as we see, a common problem with trying to predict the future is almost what we're trying to do. If a young person goes to school and tries to predict what job they will get as a result of their education and tries to sort of retrofit and design their career in that way, I think we're going to run into trouble. So I think we've got to be aware that the jobs of the future and the market of the future is changing in such a way people will have different careers. They will have several different streams in their work lives, as have I, and I'm very happy in what I'm doing. So I think it's important that we also recognise that fact and focus on obviously supporting fundamental research, but also giving people the skills that they need to succeed in business, in management, in creative endeavours, in science communication, and making sure that we are producing rounded graduates or rounded people coming out of further education.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Emma Johnston.
Hello, Lisa. Emma Johnson, Dean of Science at the University of New South Wales. Thank you for a wonderful speech. So we understand and we see there's an enormous amount of energy at the moment, energy, goodwill and resources going into the gender equity movement in STEM across Australia, and that's coming from government, it's coming from industry, and it's also coming from the higher education sector. So we're in a really good space. My question to you is, how do we normalise this? How do we make this business as usual? Because we have to recognise that we have had a good period of economic growth for decades, but we're staring down the barrel of enormous disruption, existential threats. We are going to have economic hardship biting soon. How do we make sure it's normalised before it pops off the top of the strategic agenda?
That's a really important question. We often see that in good times, and when the harvest is ready, the crops are ripening, everything goes well. But sometimes in difficult economic times, this slips off the agenda very quickly, as you say, and it can become something that is not business as usual. So I think that is why the key of what I was saying earlier is trying to embed and normalise these practices, and then in some way producing rules around these, whether they are driven by government, whether they are driven by corporations, and statements about the rules of XYZ corporation. Embedding it in the business cases for funding, embedding it in every process and procedure we have for allocating funding, and also for making sure that the corporate leaders that are chosen are well educated and have a rounded education in not only diversity and inclusion, but also, the business of as usual of running the business. So I think it's a hard thing to do, but I think SAGE is a good way to go. If we can embed something like that in the corporate sector, I think that would be maybe a stabilising force that is external from the day-to-day from each particular industry. So perhaps we need that.
Jonathan Webb.
Yeah, quick follow-up. One of the ideas that's really controversial or contentious in this debate is targets or quotas, and I'm interested in your view. We talked about the sea of men. I know that some media organisations are trying to use them to address the sea of men that they're presenting. If the ABC News website was working, you could check in on how we're doing today. We're back up. I'm told we're back online. But whether it's in the representation or in the more sort of fundamental end, in the grant awarding end, is there a role for gender targets or quotas in that, where the science starts?
Thank you. There is in the short term, I think, but it's not a solution. So we have quotas in our society. We have a parliamentary system where we elect people from a quota from each group of individuals who live in different parts of the country. That is a quota system. And we have quota systems within politics as well, for lots of different things. And very little of that is about gender. So quotas are not necessarily bad, but they are only a short-term solution. They're not a solution at all. They can help produce acceleration of a change, so they can, I won't get into physics here, but they can force a momentum change, but they can't actually fix the problems. And those problems are the fundamental ways that we do things. So we always have to have in mind that the real crux of the issue, what is broken here? What is broken? And we need to try and fix that. And in the short term, I'm not necessarily against targets and quotas. I'm not necessarily for them in all circumstances, but I think they can have a place.
Okay, some other questions from the floor. Can you give us your name and where you're from? Thank you.
Jasmine Crawford-Hill from Arete, and also Women in Nuclear. I'm not going to live 200 years, so we've got to deal with the reality of now. And so I'd like to ask you about what is the role of the learned societies, professional associations, government policy or programs in the role of mentors and advocates? Mm-hmm. The people who speak in the room when you're not there because it's currently a sea of men. The advocates when you don't meet the 60% of criteria, you might meet 60% where men will apply, but you're not meeting that 80% where you feel comfortable, where women and minorities will apply, who research shows if you tap them on the shoulder will apply and often succeed. Where is the program? Where is the energy behind formalising those programs? Because they'll happen 20% of the time, but they won't happen the rest of the time, which means we're missing out on these opportunities for someone to speak for us or to tap us on the shoulder and speak to us and say, give it a crack.
Yeah, I read a really good report recently about sponsorship instead of mentoring or, putting someone forward, actually sponsoring them. In other words, putting them forward in positions of power and in the rooms that maybe they can't access. And that's really important. I don't know if it should be driven formally, though. I'm willing to be persuaded, but I'm not sure if mentorship or sponsorship that is driven from the outside actually can be as effective as just changing the hearts and minds, having men in rooms like this, having these conversations, and having people in positions of seniority within industries, having that pointed out to them by their boards, by their management teams. You know what, you should be sponsoring some of our staff, some of our higher achievers, or the people with potential, maybe the quiet ones who aren't necessarily putting themselves forward. So I think that's a role for all of us, but I'm not yet convinced that that is something to be mandated. I think it would work better if it was actually something that people wanted to do. And I'm going to try and persuade people about these issues, but you know, we can all do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for speaking powerfully about equity in education and the workplace. My name's Christine May. I work across research and education. I have my foot on the ground in thousands of classrooms in Sydney. And alongside legislation, structures and processes, what I'm interested in is how could we work together to really shift the beliefs of the teachers, the students and the parents of girls. Our national data in NAPLAN numeracy reflects that there are differences. We know there should not be. We know that internationally that our differences are greater in Australia in terms of TIMSS and PISA between boys and girls' performance in mathematics. Sadly, the gap between girls and boys in NAPLAN numeracy exists from year 3. And part of that, I believe, in my experience in thousands of classrooms, is it's the difference in expectations. Teachers will frequently say to me that they think it is normal for there to be differences. And while ever those beliefs exist, they will flow to the students and their parents. And I really think it would take a very large collective effort beyond legislation. So your thoughts on what we might do?
Well, thank you. Yes, this is a really big issue. So when we have experts like yourself who say that these are the beliefs and attitudes, and that actually agrees with the data, I think then that's the time to decide what action would be sensible to take. So the question is, how do we change beliefs and attitudes? And if that is amongst educators who are at some point being trained to be educators, one might suggest that that could be in that process where they're trained. Could it be part of the process of training teachers, for example, to have more awareness of the research and the data that we have about girls' self-efficacy and their belief in their abilities, which is greatly reduced throughout the years when they realise that they're girls and they realise that girls aren't supposed to be good at maths. So that is a real problem. So when teachers, as I said before in my address, when teachers are aware of this, and I give talks, keynotes about this all the time at Science Teachers Associations, conferences. When teachers become aware of this, they change. They come back to me, they email me and say, I really enjoyed your address. I enjoyed learning about some of the biases that we can all perpetuate, because we all have unconscious biases, men, women, everyone has them. And the effect that they can have in the classroom and how we can mitigate that. So it just needs to be an education campaign to make people aware of the biases that we all hold and are a natural kind of a consequence of the society we grow up in and our circumstances, and then give people the tools to actually break those beliefs. And we have to break that cycle. So thank you very much.
Okay, if we keep our questions succinct, we'll get 2 more in. Thank you.
Hi, Lisa. I'm Linda McIver. I run the Australian Data Science Education Institute. I love that you spoke about the importance of relevant and meaningful projects in the classroom. My question for you, having been a teacher until last year, and I know how pressed for time and effort teachers are and how burdened by admin, is there a role for government in supporting the role of teachers to bring more authentic STEM projects to the classroom?
Yes, I think there is a role of coordination that can be done by somebody or somewhere, because the education system is different in every state and territory. That can lead to perhaps a lack of coordination in certain materials and excellent resources, and great things are happening. For example, the STEM Industry Schools Partnerships in New South Wales, which is expanding, the core learning model in Western Australia, which looks at supporting the mining sector and learning across a range of STEM disciplines. So all of these things are happening, and they're great, and we need to share success stories. So I think there does need to be more sharing of those stories and sharing of resources, because when I talk to teachers on the ground across every state and territory, the story I hear is the same. We're all making up our classroom lessons individually on our own, and there's very rarely a sharing of these materials, and I can see you nodding there. So it's really something that somebody, whether it's teachers associations, whether it's state education departments, or whether it's something else, to make sure that there is more efficiency in our sharing of great teaching practice that happens across the country.
Hi, my name's Georgina. I'm a research scientist at the University of Adelaide. Thank you for what you said about gender equity being a system problem. I feel like that really takes a lot of burden off my own shoulders, and I completely agree with it. But I'm also a young researcher, and I know I'm really good at tripping myself up. What advice do you have for the many young female researchers in this room, and how do we not transmit our imposter syndrome to the people around us?
I wish I had an answer for that, actually. I really do. And I always hesitate to give people advice because, you know, if you take advice, it can often be lousy for your circumstance. So don't listen to other people. But seriously, you know, every decision you make and every interaction you have has some kind of, effect, a ripple effect on where your career goes. So make those interactions positive and honest, and where it matters, be clear and be able to have honest conversations with people you work with and people who are your managers or superiors at work, whether that's in a private conversation, something that is planned. But have planned conversations, plan your career with your managers, and be honest and clear and open about what you want. And if you don't know, that's fine, but try and figure it out. I once wrote my goals for my life on a piece of A4, and I've achieved them, so I've got to get a new piece of A4. But, it's a good idea to sometimes just sit down and maybe, have a cold drink and write down your goals, and that's all the advice I'm going to give you.
Final question.
Thank you. Peter Howley from the University of Newcastle, Statistical Society of Australia and Science and Technology Australia STEM Ambassador. Lovely to hear you speak again today, Lisa, as always. Look, there's several new initiatives, including the STA Superstars of STEM and many under your stewardship to promote and recognise the strong, valued female leadership, research and practice in science. Whilst there's much to be done, and obviously the focus needs to be on culture and systems, I just wondered if you'd had any particular, albeit perhaps chrysalis stage, examples of positive change in public, community, school, perhaps perception in this sphere since you've assumed your Women in STEM Ambassador role.
Well, I'll take your lead, Peter, and say the Superstars of STEM program run by Science and Technology Australia. And that has really shown the difference that can be, I guess, the impact of that program has been shown to be so important. And the program in its first year had 30 participants, women who were STEM professionals, who were given, not because they were broken, but because everyone needs some help in training, so media training, opportunities to meet parliamentarians, to go into schools, to talk to the media, and to publish articles in newspapers and so on. So that program's been really popular. In its second year, it was expanded to 60 participants. Many of you are in the room today. And what participants really enjoy is the interactions that they have with one another and the ability to talk cross-disciplinary about their experiences, about their problems, and to have access to mentors. And I have some great partnerships with mentees. So, programs like this, they're focused, they're strategic, they have a specific goal. And again, that's what we have to do. It doesn't fix everything, having women go out into the public really helps the visibility of women in STEM, and it helps those women in their careers. So this is a great example, I think, and may there be many more.
And that's a hat tip to Kylie Walker for Superstars
Yep.
of STEM as well. But thank you. Everybody, please join me in thanking Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith. You can now add to your prized possession a gold members card to the National Press Club. When you need to come back to Canberra, you can come back here and ponder more ways in which you're going to change the world. It will even give you visiting rights overseas. So
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really, really should have this